Hello and welcome to Listening to the Radio.
Today, we're venturing into a really fascinating and, well, sometimes quite troubling period, the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Right.
And our focus is going to be on the experiences of Americans who were living there and also the surprising role that radio actually played both in their lives and, the broader Soviet project itself.
Right. And we're drawing our insights today from Tim Tzouliadis' book, Se pegó el texto. It really uncovers this largely forgotten story, what he calls a tragedy Americana within that whole context.
Exactly. So listeners should get ready to, well, understand a side of Soviet history that's maybe less discussed and how propaganda, especially through radio, really shaped perceptions even across borders. It's quite something.
It really is. Tzouliadis' work highlights how those initial, sometimes quite positive impressions held by some Americans changed dramatically as the realities under Stalin became clear. It's a story with some unexpected turns.
Okay, so let's start there. The book talks about these early American perspectives. What was feeding this initial optimism that some people in the U.S. had about the Soviet experiment?
Well, it's interesting how certain ideas took hold, wasn't it? I mean, despite criticisms of the Bolshevik Revolution already existing, some reports in U.S. newspapers were painting this rather idealistic picture.
Of Soviet society.
Yeah, a place striving for equality, for progress. And this really struck a chord with some Americans, especially, you have to remember, during the Great Depression. Capitalism seemed broken to many.
So they saw the USSR as what, a potential alternative?
An alternative, exactly. Huge social experiment may be worth watching, or even for some, supporting.
And it wasn't just wishful thinking, right? I mean, prominent people use things like radio to actively push these ideas. George Bernard Shaw, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. Karashi Shaw's 1931 radio address given in the U.S. after his visit, that's a perfect example. He wasn't just, sharing thoughts. He was actively trying to knock down what he called myths about the Soviet Union.
Myths? Like what? Rumors of famine or repression that were already starting to leak out.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And having a figure like Shaw with his credibility behind that message, well, it would have swayed a lot of people in America. It shows how even, let's say, independent voices could become part of this larger, maybe even unintentional propaganda narrative.
So you have this positive framing coming from some influential places, and it seems like this actually led to Americans getting involved inside the Soviet Union. The book mentions the American weekly paper in Moscow.
Yes, the Moscow News, I believe, is often called or associated with. It was more than just a newspaper, really. It was kind of a community center for Americans there.
Right.
They had practical stuff, like Russian lessons, sure. But the fact they were also doing English language radio programs for a Soviet audience, that's pretty revealing, isn't it? Well, it suggests this early, maybe somewhat naive belief in cross-cultural chat, or perhaps trying to, inject an American view into the Soviet information space. And then the social stuff, dances, trips, it created this little American bubble right there in Moscow.
A bubble that must have felt very different from the society around it.
Oh, undoubtedly. A stark contrast.
And there's that one incredibly specific example you mentioned involving radio and, well, baseball of all things.
Yeah, that's such a vivid detail, a live radio broadcast of a baseball game played by the Moscow Foreign Workers Club up in Karelia, I think it was, back in 1934.
Wow. Broadcast in English and Russian.
Both languages. Imagine tuning into that. It's fascinating because you can see maybe a dual purpose. Trying to connect with expats through a familiar sport, but also maybe showing a kind of lighthearted side of Soviet life to their own people. Who was the intended audience, really? What was the message? Makes you wonder.
It really does. It's like this strange, surreal moment frozen in time. But as the 30s wore on, this early hope started to sour for many people outside the USSR, didn't it? The book mentions specific writings that began showing a much darker picture.
Definitely. The early availability of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work in the West was, well, a huge turning point. Things like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and obviously later the Gulag Archipelago.
Yeah.
They gave this raw, unfiltered look at the Soviet prison system, the gulags, the harsh realities under Stalin.
These weren't just political arguments.
No, not at all. They were deeply personal accounts, and they just chipped away at that idealized image, exposing the enormous human cost for anyone, willing to actually look. As Tzouliadis puts it, it was when the blindfold started coming off for a lot of people.
And inside the Soviet Union, some Americans who were actually there started seeing these darker things firsthand. Eugene Lyons, for example.
Lyons' experience is quite telling. His view shifted, gradually but profoundly. He couldn't ignore the constant announcements, on Soviet radio and in the papers, listing executions.
Executions by the secret police, the GPU.
Yes, of supposed enemies of progress.
Yeah.
The sheer number of them, the often random-seeming nature of the purges. It started painting this terrifying picture, a total contrast to those earlier promises of a socialist paradise. His dawning awareness really shows the gap between the official line and what people were actually living through.
Which brings us right to how radio really worked in the Soviet Union. It wasn't just news or fun in the way we might think of it. It was a key tool of control.
Absolutely. Those English-language propaganda broadcasts aimed at American immigrants were, well, incredibly direct about it.
How so?
They literally said radio was a powerful weapon for building a classless society, not just for entertainment. It's significant because they're openly admitting radio's power to shape minds, to reinforce the state's ideology. It wasn't subtle. It was deliberate indoctrination aimed at a group they maybe thought was a bit skeptical.
And the book suggests even the seemingly harmless stuff on these broadcasts had a purpose, like discussions about what? Vacation plans?
Exactly. Even talking about holidays at Soviet resorts served a purpose. It pushed this idea of a prosperous, desirable Soviet life for these American listeners.
Right.
It subtly backed the narrative that workers had leisure time, good lives, even while other things suggested, well, something very different. It's a pretty clever way to weave propaganda into everyday topics.
And beyond those specific broadcasts, the book really stresses the constant presence of loudspeakers in public places. You couldn't escape the state's message.
No, you couldn't. Mass indoctrination via these loudspeakers everywhere. It was like ambient propaganda.
Yeah.
Always there. And there's this chilling part, book highlights too. Any mistake, any perceived error.
Like what?
Could be anything. A factory manager messes up, an engineer makes a mistake, even the wrong music choice on the radio. It could all be twisted and presented as proof of sabotage.
Sabotage by enemies within.
Exactly. It created this climate of intense fear and suspicion. Even accidents could land you in serious trouble.
That sounds like a society utterly gripped by paranoia. The part about encouraging people to find hidden fascist symbols in everyday stuff is particularly disturbing.
It is disturbing. What's striking is how it made the population complicit in finding enemies. By telling people to look for hidden threats in, say, a picture or a newspaper layout, the regime fostered this constant vigilance. It reinforced the idea that conspiracies against Stalin were absolutely everywhere.
And the radio and press just hammered this home.
Relentlessly. Reporting on supposed plots, creating this siege mentality, which then, of course, justified the state's harsh actions.
It's a terrifying illustration of how propaganda can warp a whole population's reality. But then the book shifts perspective, contrasting this with American diplomats in Moscow. They saw things differently.
They certainly did. That anecdote about the young diplomats listening to the 1936 World Series broadcast and hearing it incredibly clearly is so telling. Well, here they are, right in Moscow, enjoying this purely American cultural moment with amazing reception. While just outside their bubble, their fellow Americans are living under intense surveillance, bombarded by propaganda. The contrast just hammers home the isolation, the controlled information world the immigrants lived in, worlds apart from the diplomats' relative freedom.
And the book points out it was pretty unlikely those American immigrants even had radios capable of picking up foreign broadcasts, right?
Highly unlikely. Given the general suspicion of foreigners and the fact that things like baseball were fading out in the USSR anyway, it's hard to imagine immigrants having shortwave radios or feeling safe enough to listen if they did. Meanwhile, the Soviet state is busy staging these elaborate show trials.
Right. Broadcasting them, inviting the international press.
Exactly. Presenting it all as legitimate justice.
But the American diplomats, they weren't fooled. The diary entry from Charlie Thayer about the Bukharin trial broadcast seems pretty clear on that.
Oh, completely. Thayer writing privately that the indictment read like Gulliver's Travels, and that not even a dog would believe it. That reveals the deep, deep cynicism among the American diplomatic staff about these trials.
They saw it as political theater.
Absolutely. Pure theater. A way to get rid of opponents and cement Stalin's power. Their private skepticism really highlights the gulf between the official Soviet story and what informed outsiders could see plain as day.
Yet, despite this private skepticism among diplomats, there seemed to be maybe a hesitation to challenge the Soviets publicly. That example of the 1939 New York World's Fair.
Yeah, the lack of any real protests at the Soviet pavilion there is quite stark, isn't it?
It seems so.
What's striking is how normal, almost celebratory the atmosphere seemed around the Soviet exhibit, even as reports of the purges were definitely circulating. having both the American and Soviet anthems played for an NBC television broadcast without major public outcry. It speaks volumes about the complex politics of the time, perhaps a wish to keep diplomatic channels open, despite those growing worries.
The book also talks about that huge propaganda shift with the Nazi-Soviet pact. And radio was used to sell that new line, too.
It was. Molotov's radio speeches right after the pact are just stunning examples of ideological gymnastics.
How so?
Suddenly, the Nazis, who'd been painted as the absolute archenemy, were being praised as progressive for, believe it or not, building roads and fixing unemployment. Fascism was just dismissed as a matter of taste.
That's quite a reversal.
An absolutely abrupt reversal, broadcast to the entire Soviet population. It just shows the total control the state had over information, their ability to rewrite history, rewrite enemies and allies, literally overnight.
Then, of course, the war itself changes everything. World War II begins, and radio's role shifts again. It becomes vital for communication during this massive national crisis. We hear about some major announcements made over the air.
Yes, Molotov's announcement of the Nazi invasion in June 41, that was obviously a huge moment, broadcast on the radio, telling people the non-aggression pact was broken, that they were under attack.
A somber moment, I imagine.
Terribly somber. And then Stalin himself addressed the nation on the radio in July 41. That was huge because it was his first radio address in 3 years. People were desperate to hear from him.
And the broadcast itself was kind of unusual. The timing, his delivery.
Yes, the timing was very early morning, which hinted at the urgency. And apparently, his strong Georgian accent was really noticeable. One American journalist supposedly said it sounded like the English spoken by Italian waiters in an American movie. And there's that tiny detail, isn't there, about the sound of a glass clinking during the broadcast. A little humanizing crackle in the midst of this huge historical moment.
It's those little details that really bring it to life. Okay, so then the narrative moves into the war years, the U.S.-Soviet alliance. And again, radio plays a part in shaping perceptions back home in America.
Right. During the alliance, you had prominent figures like Vice President Henry Wallace making radio broadcasts praising Soviet efforts. He talked about development in Siberia, the supposed enthusiasm of volunteers there.
Despite the reality of forced labor camps.
Despite the well-documented reality of the Gulag system, yes. And President Roosevelt, after the Tehran conference, famously said in a radio address that he got along fine with Stalin, creating this sense of partnership. These broadcasts aimed to build wartime unity, of course, but they also tended to gloss over the darker side of their Soviet ally for the American public.
A deliberate effort, it seems, to keep the alliance smooth. But for some Americans actually in the Soviet Union, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret Wetland's story is quite powerful here.
Very powerful. Margaret Wetland was working for Soviet radio. She experienced this profound crisis of conscience after an American colleague, someone who'd actually criticized Stalin, simply disappeared.
Just vanished.
Vanished. And for her, that shattered any remaining illusions. She realized, in her words, that she was part of a diabolical machine. It really highlights the terrible personal cost for those caught up in it, even if they were initially believers or just trying to do their jobs.
The book also touches on the awful fate of some American POWs who ended up in Soviet camps, right? There's an account from a radio operator.
Yes, that's a chilling piece. A radio operator overhearing a message about a downed American plane, and then later, the quiet confirmation that the rescued crew would be, well, eliminated.
Eliminated,
Yeah.
even though they were allies.
Eliminated. It's a brutal reminder of the dangers any American faced if they fell into Soviet hands during that time, ally or not. The system could be utterly ruthless.
Even after Stalin finally died, the shadow of that era and these questions about missing Americans, they didn't just disappear. Radio Moscow announcing his death must have been a major event.
Huge. The announcement in March 1953 reportedly led to these massive, almost hysterical displays of public grief in the USSR. It really showed the power of the personality cult built up over decades, largely through propaganda, including radio.
And then later, Khrushchev comes along.
Right, and you have Khrushchev giving a televised address in the U.S. talking about peaceful coexistence, but still making these, frankly, false claims about genuine freedom back in the Soviet Union. So the use of media to manage international image, that continued.
And the search for those missing Americans, it went on for years, didn't it? Using Russian radio even.
Decades later, yes. American researchers were still putting out appeals on Russian radio and TV, trying desperately to find out what happened to people who'd vanished during the Stalin era. It just speaks to how deep the tragedy ran and how hard it's been to get answers.
The difficulty in accessing archives even now.
Exactly. It suggests the full story of this tragedy Americana, as Tzouliadis calls it, is maybe still not completely known.
Well, this deep dive into Sipigo Textor has certainly shed light on a really complex, often heartbreaking part of history. I mean, the experiences of those Americans, the sheer power of propaganda, especially via radio, and that huge gap between the ideal and the often brutal reality, these are really important takeaways.
They absolutely are. Looking back at these accounts is, I think, a crucial lesson. It reminds us about the dangers when power isn't checked, and why critical thinking, a healthy dose of skepticism towards official narratives, is always so important.
So thinking about everything we've discussed today, based on this historical context, what might be the modern versions of that kind of propaganda or that sort of, blind faith that led to such awful outcomes? And maybe more importantly, how do we stay vigilant against them now? It's definitely something worth pondering.
It really is. And for listeners who want to explore this further, Tim Tzouliadis' book, Sepigol Texto, is highly recommended, along with other histories of the period. It's a vital, though sometimes unsettling, piece of understanding the 20th century.